Right. Well, good day and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Future of Cash Beyond Corona, the third and final session of this series. My name is Guillaume Lepec. I'm the chair of CashEssentials and will be hosting this webinar this afternoon. I will quickly start with some housekeeping guidelines. Interaction is great, but due to the number of participants, it is limited to the chat room and the Q&A section. So on the right hand of your screen, you will have a chat box circled in red on the screenshot, and a Q&A and a question box, question in circled in green. So please submit the questions in the question box and chat in the other box. This session is recorded and the recording will be made available following the conference. A couple of words on CashEssentials. We are a young and small organization, but strive to become a platform for discussion, debate on the future of payments, monetary ecosystems, and also to conduct and foster high quality research on cash and its future. We're privileged that Diederik and France all sit on our steering committee. To carry out this exercise, CashEssentials has partnered with Demos Helsinki, an independent Finnish think tank focusing on global transformation and aiming to build a sustainable and fair future. Demos have a strong expertise in foresight and future studies, and have been participating in this initiative since its inception. I strongly believe we all need to develop a long-term vision for cash in order to be able to proactively steer the cash cycle and address the numerous challenges that we're facing today. To develop this vision, we've looked at futures literacy, and UNESCO defines futures literacy as the skill that allows people to better understand the role that the future plays in what they see and do today. Futures literacy teaches us that there's no single future, but rather a multitude of possible futures to navigate from. We've split this exercise into 3 stages. During the first session, we designed a futures table, a framework which reflects the most important aspects of change. In the second session, we designed 3 plausible scenarios and their implications for monetary ecosystems and cash. And today our webinar will look at designing a desirable future and discuss the roadmap to make that happen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. So by alphabetical order, I present Diederik Brugink, Head of Innovation and Payments at the European Savings and Retail Banking Group. Diederik also sits on the board of the European Payments Council and chairs the Cash Efficiency Working Group. Please note the disclaimer, Diederik's views are strictly personal. Next, we have Antti Heinonen, chairman of the Banknote Ethics Initiative and former head of Banknotes at the European Central Bank. Petteri Lillberg, Petteri Lilbo, is our futurist. He's a senior consultant at Demos and focuses on strategy, foresight, and societal impact across industries and organizations. And we have Franz Zeitz. Franz is an economist and teaches at the Weiden Technical University of Applied Sciences. His main fields of research are monetary theory, policy, financial markets, as well as payment markets and cash. Our agenda for today, we'll start with Petteri, who will share some insight on the futures literacy methodology and our exercise for today, designing a desirable scenario. We'll then ask our experts to comment on the scenario and highlight the opportunities and challenges. We will then move on to the roadmap and look at the policy decisions required today to make this scenario happen. And then we'll take questions, and I will try and wrap up. And now I will hand over to Petteri.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you, Guillaume. Yes, today is slightly different webinar from our two previous ones. If in the previous one we've tried to scope different futures, today we really try to focus on the desirable ones. And interestingly, what does desirable one mean is obviously, I think, the real question here. Guillaume, would you like to take the next one? Well, the real point behind futures thinking or futures literature is that if we didn't have foresight, we would obviously just react to events, to react to actions, and we would really have no will of our own. So once we always are interested in the future for its own sake, I think the real reason why we want everybody to be involved and excited about futures thinking, that futures thinking allows us to make conscious value-based actions and decisions rather than just reacting to events. So and really that's our focus today, is to have a debate and a discussion about what sort of society we would all want to live in and what society we would all want to strive for in the future. So today is really about not scoping what everything would be in the future, rather think about what's the future we want us to, for all of us, and what would be fair and right for us and in humans, and also for the planet. So if you followed us in the previous webinars, you've seen that we've discussed what is possible, what's probable, and in essence try to scope different types of scenarios that all are plausible. They may not be to everybody's liking, but they are something that could happen. And today, as I said, we focus on a scenario that is plausible, but also, at least from one point of view, a desirable one and wanted one. And take the next slide. So in the two first ones, we've looked at scenarios called global recovery. We look at scenarios called the return of the state, and we've looked at a scenario, let's get digital. The important point about scenarios and crafting scenarios is, in a sense, to look at the world with open eyes and really look at different alternatives. Also alternatives that may not be to your personal liking. I've been involved in a process where high-level corporate execs look at a world where corporations don't exist, and that's really the point of making scenarios, that you go outside your comfort zone and try to look at the world from multiple perspectives. Today we focus on what's a green one, incidentally, is what we call is desirable future. Next one. So And obviously, when we talk about desirable future, it's really a snapshot. It's really a point in the time. Today we talk about 2030. That out of all the possible futures, this is what we would like to happen, and really look at from a vision and vision perspective, and look at from a what sort of roadmaps, what sort of actions, and what sort of policies we might need to make this desirable future happen. Next. Yeah. One thing to note about desirable futures, though, is that whilst in these webinars we have crafted different scenarios, and again, not all of them have been to everybody's liking or reflected personal opinions, but they all been plausible. They all have had a possibility. Yes, these might in fact happen, and that same logic applies to a desirable future. Desirable future is not a crazy idea. It's not something that would be based on an idea that the Earth is flat, for instance, but rather it still has to be plausible. It can be out of the box, it can be surprising, it can be challenging, but it still needs to be something that is grounded on being plausible and realistic in that sense. So we're not talking about science fiction when we talk about desirable futures. We're talking about something that, yes, with specific actions and roadmaps, we can make this happen. All right. And the tough, and then the, I would say tough, but also the most interesting thing about desirable futures is that whilst, yes, they are actions in foresight, yes, they are exercises and thinking ahead, yes, they are exercises in thinking what might the world look like in 2030 or 2040, what's interesting and challenging about the desirable futures always force us to answer the really tough questions on our values, on our preferences, and on our visions for the world, because you can't really make up a desirable future unless you had a process where you have crystal clear answers to these questions. What's valuable to us? What's the society we want to live in? What is good? What is right? And for whom? And what are the concrete actions to make it happen? So if in the previous webinars we've looked at different scenarios from fairly open-minded, even sort of judgment-free perspectives, the desirable future is always an exercise of values and judgment and an exercise of this is what we would like to happen, and this is what we would like to see as positive. All right, but what is this scenario we are basing our discussion and the debate today? Guillaume, would you like to go through that?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Petteri. And let's take a look at the scenario that we have come up with. The starting point for this scenario is the futures table that we designed during the first webinar. And the futures table shows the key tensions and variables that we believe will shape the future and the alternative payment directions for each of those variables. To design the desirable scenario, we've asked our three experts, Antti, Diederik, and Frans, to highlight the preferred values for each of the variables. And we gave them each a color. So the color codes work as followed. The first color was yellow, and the coincidence is that two of our panelists had the exact same scenario. And then the second color was red, and you can see there are some variations. And the orange is the combination for the artists out there. The orange is the combination of the red and yellow. So the boxes in orange are the areas of total convergence. The boxes in yellow represent 2 out of the 3 experts, and red is 1. If we look at this into a little bit more detail, and I'll start with the areas of convergence. On the left side of the chart, we see that all agree on the need to mitigate global warming and reduce inequality between rich and poor countries. On the right-hand side of the chart, we also observe a consensus on the governance of technology, with the need to regulate digital platforms, as well as empower consumers to own and manage their data. If we switch back to the left and look at the social priorities, we see that all agree on the need to regulate surveillance, whether it's state or private, but there is some divergence on social priorities, with some believing that we should focus on more equality, while our third expert believes that we should be focusing more on growth and individual freedom. Lastly, the area where we see the most divergence is the middle column, which is basically the shape of the economic recovery post-COVID. 2 experts favor a global recovery driven by international organizations, while the third envisages a recovery led by a few competitive countries. And quite logically, this has implications on the supply chain, with the first believing that we need to strengthen BCP, for instance, by increasing stocks, while the other foresees a more structural diversification in sourcing. And I've missed the last column on the far right, which is the monetary aspect. And here there's pretty strong consensus, where all agree that the central bank should be the main issuers of money, and that there should be some or there should be diversification in the various forms of money. But one believes that there should be a little bit more cash than the others, but that's relatively marginal. So this is our scenario. As you can see, we've not reached a complete consensus, but it seems to me that there's a pretty strong common core with some variations, particularly on the economic front. So now I'm going to try and submit a poll. If this works, so I'm going to publish a poll and invite you to respond. Can you see that on the screens? Yes, I see people answering. And while the answers come in, we seem to have a pretty strong consensus on the scenario, which is encouraging, because if there was a consensus that it was all bad, it would have put us in a difficult situation. But now I'll let the poll on screen, and I will now hand over to Antti to comment on this scenario. Antti?
Thank you, Guillaume. So good afternoon, morning, everybody. Petteri defined a desirable future with characteristics like what kind of a society do we want to live in, and at this moment, this is my opinion of a positive future. In my case, the positive future is highlighted with the yellow and brown values Guillaume presented. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need post-World War II global institutions to lead the recovery. There can be other arrangements, but we need global policy solutions. So current challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic, global warming, governance of big tech platforms, or financial situation of the emerging market and developing economies can be solved only by global policy solutions. Learning from the pandemic. I think one of the major learnings is that robustness against disturbances will grow at the expense of efficiency. Recently, Willem Buiter characterized this development that just-in-time economics will give way to just-in-case economics. So there are good reasons to retain the cash infrastructure because of resilience, inclusion, privacy, and freedom of choice inter alia. I assume, however, that the trend of decreasing share of cash transactions will continue, and it will be not fully compensated by the increasing use of cash as a store of value. In that respect, I have a graph. Please, Guillaume. So I will continue with the same concepts I have used in the two earlier webinars, so that I'm looking at the median annual growth rate of value of banknotes in circulation. So why median growth rate? Therefore that, for example, average growth rate is not relevant because every year there are a few currencies which have very high inflation, even hyperinflation. And in that kind of situation, average will be not relevant. So for the whole 2010s, by looking at different sources, I could find reasonably consistent figures from 137 currencies. You may think that 137 currencies is not a big part of currencies, but altogether there are less than 150 currencies. I mean independent currencies because of these common currency areas. So that a big majority of currencies are included, and those which are not included are in a very difficult situation during a war situation or something like that. So that of these 137 currencies, if we look at this graph, the first observation is that the trend is declining, so that it's starting more than 12% for the median growth rate and finishes around a bit more than 7%. So that's what the current situation with the decreasing transactions and or share of transactions, but at the same time the increasing store of value use of banknotes has created. But the good news is that still the median growth rate is more than 7%. So that 68 currencies have higher or the same same growth rate, or higher or same as a little bit more than 7%, and 68 currencies have a low growth rate. Next slide, please. So my conclusion is that future development needs to be controlled by ensuring access to and acceptance of cash. With this statement, I conclude my first intervention and give the floor back to Guillaume. Thank you.
So I'll take over directly. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon also from my side. In what follows, I will concentrate only on some specific aspects of this desirable scenario and concentrate more on economy-wide aspects and not on peculiar or specific aspects of one group or another. The first thing I wanted to mention is that we all agree that the central bank should have a big role, or should play a big role in the future, in the next 10 years. What does that mean? Yeah, this does mean, on the one side, perhaps it should also foster or support the issuance of cash, but on the other side, the initiatives to develop or to issue a central bank digital currency will also stay on the agenda, I think. And if this central bank digital currency then comes more to the attention of the people, the consequences of it being existent should really be understood from many different angles. First of all, and here I raise perhaps a lot of questions, what does it mean for banks? If a central bank issues digital currencies, does it lose deposits, which then were put into the central bank? What does this mean for the competitive situation of banks? What does it mean for the general public? Do they all have then access to central bank money in a digital form? And how would that work? Does this only mean access to central bank money for the general public, or does this really mean a blockchain-based digital currency issued by the central bank? What does it mean for credit supply? Is there perhaps a pressure for the central bank not only to issue a central bank digital currency, but then also to grant credit, especially in times of crisis, which again would be a competitor then for the private banks? What does central bank digital currency mean for government balances? Why do I draw your attention to this aspect? Yeah, the reason is, if the central bank gets huge amounts of deposits from the public, the question is, what will they then do with this money? Will they invest it in government bonds? And here is the relationship then to government balances. And what would this mean for the whole financial system? Further question is, what does the issuance of central bank money mean for financial stability? Once again, especially in the case of crisis, where perhaps people withdraw money from the private sector to enormous amounts. And what does this mean for financial inclusion? If cash in circulation decreases further, especially for transactions balances, does this mean that everybody has the basic right to access a digital central bank money? And so on and so forth. And related to this, to these different aspects, is a second point: negative interest rates. Yeah, with the existence of a central bank digital currencies, you would open the room for really deeply negative interest rates. And you might then argue, why does lowering interest rates is a negative thing, is a bad thing? Yeah, surely lowering interest rates is not a negative or a bad thing per se, but going into the negative territory and deeply into the negative territory is like increasing taxes. And normally it's the same thing. Increasing taxes per se is not a bad thing, but increasing them too much and really increasing the tax burden for the economy, for the firms, for the consumers too much, that's a bad thing. And again, I draw this tax analogy because you can argue, negative interest rates, it hurts the savers, but the debtors, they profit. It's a zero-sum game. No, it's not a zero-sum game. It's like with taxes. It's not that the taxpayer has to pay and the finance minister gets the money. There are some further effects which are there, which we call as economists excess burdens, which are there and which hurt the total economy. And the last aspect I want to draw your attention to is the role of simplicity. We all agree that a diverse payment system is a good thing. But within this diverse payment system, I think that the necessary precondition for a payment media to be used by the general public to really a large extent is simplicity. And this simplicity for us, perhaps this seems an artificial aspect or an exaggerated aspect, but I've done some research on that together with the Bundesbank, with the payments studies and the payment service the Bundesbank has done. And what we found there is that even for well-established payment media like credit cards and debit cards, a proportion of the population finds it really technologically challenging to use them. And having that in mind, I cannot imagine a diverse payment system without cash, which is really simple for everybody to use. And that's why my conclusion is that a world with diverse payment media but without cash would be dystopian. Thank you very much for this first round. And I hand over to Diederik.
Thank you, Frans, for your kind words, and also good day to everybody in the audience, morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever you. Following the two previous speakers, I'm going to especially look into three sub-scenarios, basically. What if, what would be the role of cash in three of these sub-scenarios? And I depicted the scenario of what if there was no cash usage at all? The second one would be what if cash is used as a stored value only, so not for transactional purposes. And the third scenario is basically where there's a proper mix between cash and cashless solutions. If you look at the first row of this table, the impact on the cashless, of course, in the case there would be no cash at all, is that the digital payments would flourish. And as far as cash is concerned, the latest banknotes will be on the display museums shortly. So that means that in this type of scenario, and again, this is just a scenario thinking, not being a preference or whatsoever, no judgments here. This will mean that digital will drive the whole world. Data is key. Data will tell whether you are allowed to apply for loans, whether you will have access to the financial system. It will also raise a lot of concerns with respect to privacy. That's also covered in the previous webinar. Also, a lot of issues might arise when it comes to financial inclusion, also partly driven by digital literacy. And also bear in mind that this financial inclusion might not be only between those who don't have access to the digital world at all and those who haven't. But even within the digital world, people might be excluded either because they don't want to share their privacy details and hence will not be able to be assessed whether they be allowed to have loans or access to systems. So also between these digital nomads, you will see some kind of segmentation between those who have access and those who haven't. So probably not a very likely scenario. If you then look at the other extreme where cash is used still in circulation, but as a stored value only, of course, again, the digital payments will still flourish because that's then the only means that you will have at your purpose to engage into transactions. And of course, the same concerns with respect to those still valid. But if you look on cash, what would be the input there? Then you would notice that there's no real cash cycle. It's a one-way street only. Cash is being put in circulation, it's being picked up by the consumers and subsequently hoarded somewhere. That will most likely result into a situation that also the cash cycle as this is current will be adapted to accommodate only debt, meaning that there is no provision for those cases where banknotes are being returned and need to be put back into bank accounts or what have you. So the key question here is, as I mentioned in the third column, can the industry handle a reverse bank run, where out of a sudden people want to convert the cash into digital money to use it? If we have all abandoned the system of cash recirculation or the collection of cash, it will put some severe impact on the world as a whole for cash. Then subsequently, indeed, in the scenario where cash and cashless both are used for transactional purposes, the key here is that both products position themselves vis-a-vis each other, and the proper balance need to be found. What is the right product for the right people at the right place to fulfill the specific needs in that particular case? And these then could very well exist next to each other. Of course, it's key that in that situation, a proper balance needs to be maintained. Both type of payments need to have sustainable and healthy volumes, because also here, of course, if the balance flips out of balance and the cashless transactions start to flourish, meaning that the cash will be at risk, we all know that that can have severe impact on the sustainability of the cash cycle and the cash recirculation model, meaning that people might start doing cost-cutting or efficient gains type of exercises there, resulting in cash being more expensive again, and then can turn into kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, which means that at the end of the day, cash might disappear, and you might in the one of the other scenarios there. So again, the key message here is then that the proper balance need to be found. The overall message, I would say, in this particular observation is that we need to ensure that the resilience of the system, of the cash system, is key. And I will cover that basically more in my next intervention. So with that conclusion, I would like to hand back to Guillaume. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diederik. And now well, before we move to the second part, I will try again to publish another poll, which should be on screen now. So the question is, who do you think would suffer the most in a world without cash? So yes, I can see answers coming in. And while you respond to that, I'll kick off the second section, where we move on to our roadmap. So quite simply, we now have a scenario, but the question is, what actions need to be made, what policy decisions need to be made today to turn this into a reality? And this question applies to all stakeholders. I'm not sure we'll get a clear opinion of all, because they're not all represented on our panel. But I'll invite our panelists to cover this from all stakeholders' opinion. So where are we with our poll? So I see that the two main losers of a world without cash would be, one, consumers, and two, the economy as a whole. Very good. And now I'm going to hand over to Antti and listen to invite him to share his thoughts on the roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume. So my second intervention addresses the concrete actions needed to make my desirable future to happen. First, we need an efficient and resilient cash infrastructure. If market forces wouldn't guarantee it, central banks should consider ensuring the access to and acceptance of cash by regulation, subsidizing, or by own involvement. I will not elaborate more the models. Diederik will address it in his second intervention. My second point is that in order to have an impact on the development, we need more information. Statistical information is not sufficient today. So almost all central banks provide detailed statistical information on non-cash payment instruments issued by the private industry. But around 50 central banks provide very little statistics related to cash, their own product. That sounds me a little bit odd. Based on the information, we need also more research. We need payment studies in order to understand how the behavior is changing. We need also research how cash functions as a fallback in emergencies. And for example, longer power blockouts. As we all know, cash is also very digital today, so that mostly deliveries are done by electronic means, and naturally we should have a clear understanding how we handle the situation, in particular when there is a longer power blackout. Research also means, I saw there was already one question regarding this issue we have discussed earlier, that what is the role of cash in transmitting the COVID-19 virus. And we really need research on the role of cash in this respect. And it's quite interesting example that a couple of weeks ago, World Bank issued their global economic prospects. So in this month, and they have it's a long document, and they are referring to different aspects. And one issue they are addressing is the characteristics of informal workers. And in this context, they use the following statement, that these informal workers often live and work in crowded conditions and conduct all transactions in cash. Factors that enable the spread of disease, so that they draw a very clear conclusion that if you handle cash, you are enabling the spread of disease. So we really have work in this area. Then we need also communication, more communication. Why cash provision is part of the public infrastructure, why we need cash, why we need a resilient cash infrastructure. And finally, the banknote community should show good citizenship, focus on ethical business practices and ecological footprint. With these words, I thank you and hand over to Franz. Please, Franz.
So thank you, Antti. For me to get this desirable scenario done, I think it is important that governments and especially central banks, they should give up their position, which they have up to now nearly worldwide, which is a neutral one with respect to payments media, cash or cashless. In my view, this position can no longer be held up, especially with respect to public money. They should really give up this neutral position and try to stress the arguments in the positive sides of public money, which is not only cash for sure, which is also perhaps CBDC, and also argue that with respect to diversification, there is a special role of cash, especially as far as the properties of a payment media are concerned. And I see no electronic alternative to cash with respect to the characteristics of cash. To mention only a few, it's ease of use, is anonymity, is offline use, is final settlement, and so on and so forth. And that I really see no cashless payment media which really can overtake all these characteristics. Second, with respect to banks and retailers, surely we should not describe what they should do, what their business model should be. They should decide in their own self-interest. But what is essential in my point of view is that they are aware of the consequences of a changing payment landscape. For example, if banks no longer guarantee the access to cash, what is the role of banks in this new environment? What if the central bank issues central bank digital currency? What is the role of a bank there? Is it then a pure payment provider? Or what is the consequences for the competitive situation in the financial industry if central banks then issue a digital alternative, if perhaps the big techs issue a digital payment media? And the same is true for the retailers. What if they no longer accept cash? Does this change the share of online retailers with respect to stationary retailers? What about the competitive situation there? And so on and so forth. Third aspect I want to draw your attention to is that you should really try to find new and profitable business models within the payment system and with also still existing cash. What does this mean? Yeah, there might be profitable cooperations, for example, between banks and retailers or banks and payment providers, which might really be very profitable to work together in this field. In Germany, for example, there are some initiatives where banks and retailers work together in a very profitable way with respect to cash logistics. Fourth aspect is it is always mentioned that it's finally the consumer who should decide. But my impression often was that it's really specific consumers which finally raise their voices. And you should take all consumers into account. What does all mean? The old and the young, the rich and the poor, those with a bank account, those without a bank account, the well-educated and not so well-educated, the rural population and those living in cities, and so on and so forth. And these should have really, yes, say, objective information on payment media. And there again is a role for the government. I would argue that the government should perhaps provide a platform for this information. And the final aspect is that, yeah, up to now, cash is really, yeah, not a local, but a national device. Usually, each country has its own currency. We have dollarization, we have euroization, we have currency union, sure, but perhaps from against this background with good reasons for cash to exist in the payment spectrum, there might be a role for a transactional currencies, which might not be a world currency, but transactional currencies, further dollarization or euroization, or even a case for currency unions. For sure, I know that there are other aspects too which have to be taken into account, but maybe this is one thing to think about. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Diederik.
Thanks, Frans. And indeed, in my particular case, I'm going to look at how the whole cash cycle, the distribution, but also the collection model should look like to have it resilient for the future. So the key action that needs to be undertaken for such a desirable scenario, where we all agree that cash should and have raison d'être in such a scenario, is that we need to have a proper design of the cash cycle model that future-proof. And in that exercise, fundamental choices need to be made. On the one hand, you can have one extreme where the cash cycle consists of actors that see it as a profitable business to be engaged in that cash cycle, which means there's value in it for all. It's a more kind of a multi-sided market, and there could be potential network effects identified. But again, there it's key that there is sustainable cash volumes floating around, meaning that everyone within that particular cycle and in that model can make profit. That's probably a very ideal world, but with its one extreme scenario. Another choice is that you have an extreme where the whole cash cycle is basically built on some kind of utility-based model, like the electricity coming out of the wall or the water coming out of the pipes, where it's basically a kind of utility function, distribution and collection of cash. And that also makes a huge difference for how the commercials work in such a model. Who owns that infrastructure? Is it maybe the government who would be responsible for this type in this type of scenario for providing this utility function? And can we at some point in time, for example, see the police or the army driving around to replenish ATMs and collect ATMs from merchants? Utility-based model puts a different underpinning business model in it. Also, if banks still need to participate in the utility-based models, it means they need to get the revenues from providing the utility function, which means they probably get it from the government in the form of some kind of tax distributions, then that they have to charge consumers for it. And speaking of banks, what will be the whole role for banks in such a scenario, or what are the two scenarios? Of course, in a value-based model, it's clear that banks can play a role there and make some money out of it as well. So for them, it's a sustainable business. But in a utility-based model, indeed, how will the revenue flow there? Who is funding the utility function of banks there? So that's also a key question to ask. And in fact, as you can see in the forward box, for all the actors in the cash cycle and in the model, the clear actors need to be defined. What's their role, what's the function, and also what's their underlying business model? How can they play a long-term sustainable role in the whole cash cycle? And if you have all these building blocks in place and put the puzzle together, we can start defining measures to ensure the long-term sustainability of these business models, to make sure that these models are future-proof. And again, as stated before, and also have proper resilience, also to make sure that they can cope at least with some small fluctuations, either upwards or downwards in increases or decreases in cash volumes, that the system still can handle those. So with that food for thought, and the actions to be taken, I hand over back to Guillaume. Thanks.
Thank you, Diederik. We've now covered the roadmap, and we will take questions. But as we do that, I would like again to publish a poll and invite you to vote. What actions do you think should be taken to make this scenario happen? And while you do that, let's switch to the questions, and we'll start with this question on. We'll start with this question from Mike Cowling on the risk of transmission of COVID. How do we dispel the myth that cash use is not dangerous? Antti, you started commenting on that. Do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Guillaume. So we discussed it also, I think, in the first during the first webinar, and it's so long everything is based on views, it doesn't help. So that we need research and we need publication of the research. And so that in a way, the academic, those who are experts in that area can confirm that the laboratory tests have been convincing and they trust for the results. So long we are saying that it's misinformation, but we can't support it with the research. I mean, it doesn't help. So that we definitely need research, and there was a webinar last week organized by Currency Research where Ton Rose told about the test done by the ECB, which so far have very convincing results, but naturally they are not yet concluded. So that we need results which are published.
Thank you. Question from Pavey. Hello, Pavey. All speakers have very good points for what should be considered to ensure the cash cycle. Justification of central banks' actions must be solid. Defining cash as utility is one of the key questions. Any views on the main arguments? Diederik, you raised the point of utilities. Do you want to start?
Yes, and of course I don't have all the answers yet, but I think they should be part of the fundamental debate that follows basically our discussion here, and that should start right now. I think central bank play a key role. We also saw that in the scenarios before that if cash is being issued, central banks are the proper place for that, the proper custodian for the trust in the currency. And to that end, I think it's key that they continue to exist, but also key that they take one of the leading roles in the debates going forward. Thank you.
Anything to add, Antti or Frans?
No, nothing from my side.
No, I think everything is said.
Okay, the questions have disappeared from my screen, so someone. Sorry, it's back. Question from Glenn. Sarvadi, hello Glenn. How common are laws today to mandate cash acceptance? In the US, there is a trend in this direction at the local level. As far as I know, France has the acceptance of cash is mandatory, and I recently discovered that it was also the case in Denmark, in the Czech Republic, and surprisingly in China. Any other thoughts, Antti?
No, I think that it's still very few examples. I mean, so that in a way, cash is a legal tender, naturally, I think everywhere. But what does it mean is another issue. So that in most cases, it only means that you can settle a debt with that. But it doesn't mean that it's accepted as by the cashier if there is information that they don't accept cash.
Yep. And now we have almost the reverse question. And Diederik, maybe you want to take this one from Pavey. Who would want to use cash as a store of value if it is not accepted as a payment, only to bring it back to the banking system?
That's a very good question, Pavey. And indeed, the reason why I put this in the scenario is that at the moment cash is used twofold. On the one hand, it's used for transactional purposes, but on the other hand, the need for the stored value hoarding purposes. It may be even considered hypothetical that I considered, okay, what if you take out the transactional part and cash is only used for the stored value purposes? With that in mind, I started elaborating on that. But of course, it's not something you can do in an endless matter. So it was more academic, also especially to point to the fact that even if you don't use cash for transactional purposes, and seemingly it's a one-way street out of the central banks via the banks or whatever to consumers, that you also need to maintain the return part of the street. So cash can be exchanged bank for commercial bank money or whatever you can. So it's more a type of academic thinking trigger. Then I believe there will be a world that cash will be only used for stored value purposes. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
May I add something? May I add?
Yep.
Only one point. For me, the most important thing with respect to store of value aspects is that as long as there is no CBDC, this is the only way to have access to a secure payments medium. Even if it's not used for payments, it's the most secure one, the most secure asset you can have. So why not use it? Especially in a situation where you do not get, you only have assets which are risky, which carry interest rates. All the risk-free assets don't carry any interest. So for me, this is quite logical. Even if this is academic, as you mentioned, Diederik, that we don't have such a world where it's only used for store of value purposes.
Thanks. Interestingly, if you look at the polls, the 40% of the people who've answered think that legislation to mandate the acceptance of cash is the most important action to ensure its a success.
Maybe one point to that one, and also indeed to the previous question on the acceptance of cash. Interestingly, as some people might be aware, at the moment there's a court case pending in front of the European Court of Justice. It's for those who like to look it up. It's a case C42319, which is specifically for a German taxpayer who wanted to pay, I believe, his television taxes to the authorities in cash, and yes, he was not allowed to do so. And it seems that maybe in the second half of this year, some more clarity will be provided there with the Advocate General of the European Court, that might shed some light on the discussion too.
Yes, I believe the answer is due by the end of September. Question from Leonor. Why do you think there's a need to promote cash? All the other means of payments have been promoted and cash is still there with an important role. Franz?
Yeah, it's still there. You're right. But the question is, will it stay in the next 10 years? And against the background of the crisis periods we have seen and the advantages cash has in such crisis periods, and against the properties of cash, which I really find, where I find it convincing that up to now there is no other payment media which can guarantee or which has the same properties, I would argue that there is a need for the government to give up their neutral positions, even if up to now that was not necessary. But in the future, I think this might be necessary to promote, public money, I would call it, to the benefit of the whole economy. I would not argue to actively promote, but to give up the neutral position of central banks.
There's a question here from Farhad Mafi. Is there a study that shows the cost of using cash for the banks and the associated savings if we go 100% e-cash? I'll answer that because we were supposed to hold a seminar some months ago on this topic, and which has been postponed until February. Yes, there are a number of studies which show different results. But I think what at least my personal conclusion is that one way of maintaining the cost of payments low is to have some form of competition. But the other aspect is that if the use of cash declines, well, it means that the marginal cost of cash as a payment also increases. So it's not just a simple answer of what is cheapest. It depends on the context. And the latest report from the Bank for International Settlement clearly explains that the cost of processing digital payments is far more significant for the smaller merchants. So I think there's also an issue of fairness. And now we have, I'll take one last question from James Shepherd Barron. Does the introduction of CBDC by definition require the abolition of cash? Deidre, Antti, do you want to?
No, well, when James is asking by definition, I can answer not by definition. So that in principle, nobody knows yet.
Oh.
Okay. Well, that hadn't happened to us for a while.
Yeah.
I can take over.
No, Frans, yours.
Not by definition, as Antti mentions, but I would argue that the more cash in circulation declines, the higher the pressure will be for central banks to issue or to at least think about issuing central bank digital currencies, because and everybody's access to such a currency, but by definition, this is not the case. They can coexist together.
Yeah, I would simply add that as long as we don't have central bank digital currencies, it's difficult to agree on definitions. And I don't believe that central bank digital currencies cover all of the attributes of cash. So depending on the form of CBDC, I think we could very well see some coexistence. Right. For the sake of time, we'll stop here with questions, and what we'll do is we'll try and answer the remaining questions in writing. I'm going to try and wrap up, which is a bit of a challenge. But we discussed during the first webinar how the pandemic had severely impacted cash and payments. But we also mentioned that the overall, the payment system, cash and non-cash, had demonstrated robustness. But I thought it was interesting that over the past couple of weeks, we've seen a series of events which I think are symptomatic of some of the tensions that we discussed throughout this Futures Literacy Initiative. I won't mention them all, but I'll highlight just a few. In Zimbabwe, mobile money platforms have been banned as the currency continues to lose value, and people are switching back to US dollars. Just as a reminder, Zimbabwe was the first country to go cashless when it stopped printing banknotes in 2009 after a period of hyperinflation. So mobile money companies have been accused of fanning the spike in the exchange rate of the Zim dollar, and have been banned by the government. A couple of weeks ago, the European Commission opened an antitrust investigation into Apple Pay, and basically it's looking at the refusal by Apple to open up the NFC functionality to third parties, typically to banks or payment service providers. Just last week, the Central Bank of Brazil suspended WhatsApp payments just a week after they were introduced in the country, citing competition issues in the mobile payments market. And of course, I'm sure you've all by now heard about the German payments processor Wirecard, which has admitted to losing 1.9 billion euros and has since filed for insolvency. The CEO has been charged, and the German regulatory authority is also been investigated by the European Union. There was a comment in one of the questions, but yeah, just last week, the ruling Spanish ruling coalition submitted a draft law in Parliament suggesting the gradual elimination of cash. I understand that today that project was taken off the table. It's caused quite some stir in Spain, typically because it would also have challenged a number of existing European treaties. So I just think that, yeah, we showed resilience, but we also realize that we're facing key challenges in the future in terms of financial inclusion, fairness, sustainability, resilience, and privacy. If we look at some of the points we discussed today, I think it's important to keep in mind that a future of cash is possible. Cash will not be here forever because we think it's important. It has to be, it will only stay if we take the strategic decisions to make it stay. It's also important to highlight the future with cash is possible, probably not desirable. And we've also, I believe, come to the conclusion that cash needs to be part of a society which is sustainable, fair, resilient, but also respectful of individual privacy. And to achieve this desirable future, we need a roadmap. And I think there are 4 key areas that require action. One is infrastructure. We need to maintain and develop the existing infrastructure for cash. And I'll recall the words of Front Sites saying that if cash disappears, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to recreate that infrastructure. Secondly, question of cash cycle models. There's been, over the past decades, we've seen many central banks across the globe reduce their footprint and operational involvement in cash. And I believe it may be time to reverse that trend. But again, Antti also highlighted the fact that there could be alternative solutions in terms of subsidization and or regulation. It also raises, as Diederik said, the fundamental question of what is the role of banks in this future model. Communication is a third area, and Front suggested that central banks should give up their neutral position. I would insist on the fact that regulators need to do so as well. I mentioned the case of Spain, and not just to pick on one country. I live in a country which was the first to introduce limitations on cash payments. But I think there's a strong need for education of regulators to help them better understand the societal role of cash. And last but not least, an area which is close to my heart is the area of research, because fundamentally CashEssentials was established to promote research, and I definitely think that's something we need to pursue. In terms of next steps, This Futures Literacy project is ongoing, and this is something we will pursue. This was the last webinar of this series, but we have another webinar on the 8th of July, which is quite adjacent to this topic, which focuses on Cachetech. So what is Cachetech? Well, Cachetech is basically the combination of cash and fintech. So we'll be hearing from companies which have leveraged new technologies, communication technologies, to improve access and acceptance of cash. This project will also be a core part of the Future of Cash conference, which is scheduled on the 17th and 18th of February next year in Madrid. And for the rest, I invite you to follow us on our website, social media. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank most warmly Petteri, Diedrich, Frans, and Antti for their support and insight, and thank all of you on the webinar, and hope to see you all next time. Stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye from my side.
Thank you also from my side.
Yep, and thank you from myself as well.